In the quiet hills of Rockbridge County, Virginia, the year was 1883, an era when winter decided which families survived and which ones struggled. As the first cold winds swept across the Blue Ridge, most homesteaders spent their days rushing to finish stone hearths and patch drafty walls before the snows arrived. But one man worked differently. While neighbors stacked firewood and argued about chimney design, 43-year-old mountain craftsman Elias Garrett could be found far from his cabin door, pickaxe in hand, carving a strange trench into the earth. Instead of building upward like every sensible person, Garrett dug down, 40 feet deep into a sloping hillside that faced the weak winter sun. What looked, at first glance, like the burrow of an oversized animal was actually a tunnel that dipped underground, ran straight through clay soil, and then slowly angled back up toward the base of his cabin. The locals had never seen anything like it. Tom Rigsby, who passed by with his wagon almost daily, shook his head and joked that Garrett had lost his mind. "Looks like a rabbit hole to nowhere," he muttered. Others were even less kind. Hiram Pike, a wood hauler known for his loud opinions, burst out laughing the day he watched Garrett shovel dirt down the slope. "Heat don't travel downhill, Eli," he shouted. "Even smoke knows better." To the valley's farmers and homesteaders it was simple. Warm air rises. Cold air sinks. Everybody knew that. And nobody argued with physics. But Garrett wasn't experimenting for entertainment. The winter before had nearly killed him. Smoke-heavy fires had burned his lungs raw, leaving him sick for weeks. As a blacksmith and stonemason who had worked across the upper Shenandoah, he understood structure, drafts, natural heating, and the stubbornness of cold air better than most. Surviving pneumonia gave him a new obsession. He needed cleaner heat. And more importantly, he needed a system that didn't devour firewood from sunrise to bedtime. So when he came to Rockbridge County that April, he arrived with more than the typical settler's kit. He carried years of experience, stone foundations in the valley, forge work in Augusta County, and a stubborn belief that there had to be a better way to warm a cabin. His new 17 by 20-foot chestnut cabin looked ordinary. Dovetailed corners, tight joinery, and fresh lime clay chinking sealing every gap. Solid, simple, reliable. But beneath it he planned something radically different. Unlike his neighbors, Garrett wasn't thinking about chimney draft or firebox depth. He was studying the land itself. 30 paces from his front door lay a south-facing slope that captured sunlight nearly all day, even in winter. Old-timers preferred these slopes for root cellars because they stayed naturally temperate year-round. Cool during blistering summers. Mild during the worst freezes. Garrett realized something few others even contemplated. What if the earth itself could be used as a giant heat battery? Instead of burning stacks of wood to generate heat, what if he could heat air using sunlight, run it through a long underground path surrounded by stone, and let the warmed ground feed heat back into the air? The idea was unheard of in the 1880s, but Garrett had spent enough years around masonry to know the truth. Stone remembers heat. Soil remembers temperature. And the earth below the frost line always hovers around the mid-50s Fahrenheit. If he could harvest solar warmth at the tunnel entrance and allow the air to pass slowly through a stone-lined channel, the ground itself would stabilize the temperature. Then, using nothing but natural draft, created by the difference between cold outdoor air and warmer indoor air, his cabin could pull the conditioned air upward without a single mechanical device. To most people this sounded like magic. To Garrett it was simply nature doing the work. Tom Rigsby first realized something unusual was happening when he spotted Garrett stretching a line level and marking the hillside with stakes. Rigsby paused his wagon, chewing the thought. The stakes clearly showed a downhill line, something you would expect if someone was laying drainage pipe, not heat. He chuckled and rode on. A few days later, Hiram Pike stopped his ox cart and leaned on his load of split oak. He listened as Garrett tried explaining ground temperatures and solar heat storage. But Pike only smirked and said what everyone else was already whispering. "Winter's gonna prove it useless." Mary Ellen Corbett, managing her own homestead alone, came next. When Garrett described his idea of placing a hinged mica panel at the tunnel mouth, so sunlight could enter and warm the air, she bit her lip to hide a laugh. The mental image of a tiny window for underground heat seemed too absurd to take seriously. But the sternest critic, Caleb McBride, delivered the valley's final verdict. He owned a new No. 8 parlor stove, the pride of his cabin. To him, store-bought iron stood above any backyard experiment. "When frost comes," McBride said, tapping his stovepipe confidently, "you'll be asking for one of these. Science is one thing, Eli. Winter is another." Even Doc Abernathy, who usually supported new ideas, worried about stagnant air collecting underground. The Reverend feared dampness and bad vapors. Mothers fretted over sickness. Children teased that Garrett was digging a tunnel to China. Yet Elias kept digging. By June he had created a 40-foot underground corridor, roughly 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide, running straight toward his cabin. The walls were crude clay and loam, carved neatly but left unlined. Though the work was grueling, it went faster than he expected. But Garrett, with his mason's instincts, saw trouble before the neighbors did. The floor dipped in spots. The walls were too soft. And the run was perfectly level, good for root cellars, bad for drainage. Without a slope, water would pool. Without stone, walls would shed mud. And without contour, airflow would slow to a crawl. His fears materialized in late July when a furious summer storm dumped rain for 3 straight days. Water seeped through every weak point, collecting in low pockets, turning sections of the trench into slippery mud. To the neighbors, this only confirmed what they believed all along: Garrett was wasting his time. But for Elias Garrett, the setback only meant one thing. The design needed stone. It needed precision. And above all, it needed to keep going. The first real flaw in Garrett's design appeared only days after the July storm. When he stepped into the half-finished tunnel, the air felt damp and heavy. Thin beads of moisture clung to the earthen walls, gathering wherever warm and cool temperatures collided. The floor told an even worse story. Water sat in shallow pools, and by the end of the week, some sections were deep enough to reach the tops of his boots. Garrett walked the length of the tunnel with a willow switch, marking each depression like a surveyor charting a riverbed. The deepest pockets lined up exactly with the uneven cuts he had overlooked during the first dig. His mistake was clear, but the water revealed something bigger. The perfectly level trench he had so carefully carved was actually the enemy. Without a downslope to guide runoff toward the hillside opening, water simply stopped and gathered. And the rough dirt walls, instead of letting air slip past, grabbed hold of moisture and slowed circulation. Even worse, the flat run weakened the natural buoyancy he needed to create a continuous draft between the collector and the cabin. If the system was going to work, he needed to rebuild it with the precision of a workshop instrument, not a frontier trench. And so, reluctantly, he prepared to redo the entire bottom. He carved the tunnel floor again, this time giving it purpose. For the first 22 feet, from the cabin outward, he shaped a subtle but consistent slope, 3/4 of an inch per foot. This new grade would serve as the drainage channel, carrying away condensation and stormwater. At the deepest point he dug a small pit lined with 6 inches of rounded river gravel. A narrow French drain extended from the sump and emerged below the solar collector outside, ensuring water could never pool anywhere inside the tunnel again. For the remaining 18 feet, Garrett reversed the angle and raised the tunnel at 1/2 inch per foot. That upward slope was crucial. Once warmed, the air needed a natural path to rise toward the cabin, completing the thermosiphon cycle that would keep air moving day and night without a single moving part. Every fraction of an inch mattered. A pitch too steep would cause turbulence and slow the draft. Too shallow and warm air would linger instead of rising. What looked like simple digging to his neighbors was actually the physical backbone of the entire system. The next major improvement was more laborious: stone. He stripped the tunnel walls down to clean earth and began rebuilding them with dry-laid fieldstone. Each rock was handpicked for size and shape, creating a 4-inch thick lining that added thermal mass and provided smooth surfaces for air to travel through. Moisture was encouraged to fall inward, slipping toward the drain instead of soaking the walls. The arch of the tunnel demanded the most careful craftsmanship. Every stone had to interlock tightly, forming a crown that couldn't sag under shifting soil. The cross-section had to remain consistent, the same width, the same height. Otherwise the airflow would stall and compromise the system. When the stonework was complete, Garrett coated the surfaces with a thin lime sand wash. It wasn't meant for beauty. The old-world plaster created a smooth finish that cut down on drag, letting warmed air glide through the tunnel instead of fighting its way along rough stone. The coating was thin enough not to block the stone's ability to absorb and release heat. When finished, the passage measured 18 inches wide and 22 inches tall. Dimensions chosen deliberately to balance heat exchange with steady airflow. With the tunnel reconstructed, Garrett turned his attention to the most ridiculed part of the plan: the solar collector. On the south-facing hillside he built a wooden intake box, painted dark to drink in sunlight. The interior was simple, a cavity designed to trap heat. A mica pane salvaged from an old stove door sat on hinges, creating a primitive solar window. Closing it concentrated heat, opening it allowed for cleaning. A wire screen kept out everything from insects to drifting leaves. At the cabin he carved a 10 by 12 inch stone vent directly through the foundation wall. Into this opening he installed a hand-forged damper, allowing him to fine-tune the airflow. High near the roofline he bored a 4-inch exhaust hole. Heat rising from the cabin would escape through this vent and create the draft needed to pull fresh air through the tunnel. The first real test came during a bright October afternoon. Garrett crouched beside the collector, struck a sulfur match and held it to the intake. The yellow smoke curled inward instantly, no hesitation, no backdraft. Minutes later it drifted from the cabin's ridge vent, an unmistakable sign the circulation loop was working. Inside the cabin, an old mercury thermometer confirmed what instinct told him. The temperature climbed from 46 degrees in mid-afternoon to about 60 degrees by sunset. Not a stick of wood had burned. Not a single ember glowed. Yet the cabin warmed purely from autumn sunlight and the steady temperature of the earth beneath it. News about the strange earth furnace traveled faster than Garrett expected. The valley that had mocked him all spring now split into camps as fall set in. Doc Abernathy became one of his strongest supporters. The physician had seen far too many cramped winter cabins filled with stale, smoky air. A system that circulated clean warmth without choking fumes intrigued him. When Garrett asked for help applying the lime wash, Abernathy arrived with a brush in hand, working side by side with him. A doctor lending his time gave the project unexpected legitimacy. Reverend Josiah Martin, however, pushed back forcefully. The idea of underground air troubled him deeply. He warned families that unseen vapors might breed disease, stirring memories of children falling sick in airtight winter cabins. His concerns carried weight. When a preacher warned of unseen dangers, people listened. Mary Ellen Corbett took a more practical middle ground. She doubted the tunnel could outperform a good iron stove, but she respected hard work. She even offered to sew a felt curtain to seal the interior vent on especially cold nights. Her cautious help reflected cautious hope. But Tom Rigsby? He grew more irritated by the day. He had invested heavily that summer upgrading his own hearth, and watching a neighbor chase fancy ideas made him feel as though his decades of knowledge were being challenged. He yelled from his wagon that Garrett should quit digging and buy iron, a shout he repeated every time he passed by. Yet none of the noise mattered to Garrett. What mattered was that the tunnel worked, and winter was coming. The old master stoneworker inspected the underground passage with the calm confidence of a man who had built half the valley with his own hands. He traced the dry walls with slow movements, checking the slope, the joints, and the way the stone carried its weight. His judgment mattered. When Boone spoke, people listened. "Build stone correctly," he would often say, "and it'll stand like a mountain cave." After 4 decades of digging cellars, cutting foundations, and shaping rock, his approval meant that Garrett's tunnel wasn't just functional. It was structurally exceptional, even if the true test of its heating design was yet to come. Garrett's project had taken shape in 4 deliberate stages through the chilly month of November. He worked with the deliberate patience of someone who believed accuracy beat speed every time. The first phase, 9 full days, went into digging, shaping the tunnel's grade, and establishing drainage lines that would decide how the system behaved for decades. The next 6 days were dedicated to stonework, stacking, setting, smoothing, and building up the thermal mass that would absorb and radiate heat. After that came 2 days of carpentry, crafting the collector box and fitting the mica panels that would channel sunlight into the system. The final 3 days tied everything together: the damper, the foundation vent, and the interior connection that allowed the cabin to breathe with the tunnel. By month's end, Garrett had built something remarkable. The 40-foot underground channel held a perfectly consistent cross-section of 18 by 22 inches. Beneath its 4-inch thick stone walls lay 6 inches of gravel to drain water. The downhill run, 22 feet long, sent moisture safely to daylight, while the rising 18-foot stretch completed the thermosiphon loop. He included thoughtful safeguards too: drainage along the entire floor, small openings for inspection, and a roofed collector that shed rain while still catching sunlight. A removable screen filtered air entering the system, and the interior damper could be cleaned, adjusted, or shut at will. Around him, neighbors were preparing their homes the traditional way, methods that had worked for generations, but were about to meet the harshest test of their lives. Caleb McBride extended his stovepipe and installed a tin hood meant to capture rising heat. Tom Rigsby rebuilt his hearth with thicker stone and stacked extra firewood. Mary Ellen Corbett relied on her faithful cook stove, banking the fire each night and hanging quilted curtains to keep the cold from creeping through the doors. It was the way Valley families had prepared for every winter before. But this winter would not be like any other. By mid-December, Garrett's early experiments delivered astonishing results. On clear days, his cabin warmed itself to the low 60s entirely from sunlight. At dawn, the stone near the foundation vents still felt warm. On cloudy days he used only a small cooking fire, yet the tunnel carried most of the heating load. His temperature logs, kept with the careful discipline of a man who believed numbers tell the truth, showed a pattern that defied all the old rules. The system that had sparked arguments and skepticism was quietly proving it could do something ordinary stoves could not. But the valley had not yet seen the worst. 16 winters passed before that test arrived. It began on February 10, 1899. A monstrous Arctic air mass swept across the eastern United States, dragging temperatures into uncharted territory. Weather stations reported record-breaking lows. Staunton fell to 12 below zero. Monterey and Highland County dropped to an almost unimaginable 29 below. Snow buried the valley, the sky turned iron gray, and no sunlight broke through for days. This was the Great Arctic Outbreak, the coldest event the region had ever recorded. Caleb McBride was the first to find his improvements failing. His parlor stove, blazing red every night, couldn't stop the temperature inside his home from sliding into the 30s by morning. The extended stovepipe he installed actually made matters worse, pulling drafts so hard that cold air poured down the system faster than the fire could warm the room. After several nights, ice crystals formed on the inside walls. McBride was forced to burn coal and oak together simply to keep the wash water from freezing. Tom Rigsby fared no better. The powerful draft of his rebuilt hearth consumed nearly half a wagon load of seasoned oak in 3 days. Yet even with the fire roaring, his cabin barely climbed into the 40s. The lime clay packed around the chimney cracked from the extreme temperature differences between inner and outer stone, letting icy air pour inside. Frost formed on the inside of his chimney flue, a sign that even his improved design couldn't overcome the Arctic assault. Mary Ellen Corbett's dependable cook stove, the same one that had warmed her family through countless storms, fell apart under the relentless cold. It heated unevenly, swinging from red-hot to almost cold as its fuel demands skyrocketed. Her quilts, her chinked walls, her carefully banked fire, none of it mattered. By the second morning her family awoke wearing coats, their breath visible, their wash basin skinned with ice even though it sat inches from the stove. Meanwhile, Garrett's underground system worked with eerie steadiness, almost indifferent to the deadly cold. His temperature log continued, day after day, to show indoor readings between 58 and 62 degrees, even in the darkest stretch of the outbreak. When no sunlight reached the collector, he burned only small amounts of coal for cooking. The tunnel took care of the rest. And on the single clear day after the storm broke, sunlight struck the mica window and pushed his cabin to 65 degrees, without a single fire lit. In a winter that defeated every traditional method, Garrett's forgotten engineering stood alone, proving that the simplest old ideas can sometimes outlive the most trusted traditions. The tunnel's remarkable ability to hold warmth was only half the story. Its true victory appeared in something far more practical: fuel use. While other families watched their stoves devour wood at a terrifying pace, Garrett's weekly consumption barely equaled a single day's worth of burning in nearby cabins. His journals, carefully kept throughout the coldest weeks, proved that his system used roughly 1/10 the wood of the traditional heating methods within the valley. The tunnel's thick stone walls, warmed by whatever sunlight the winter sky allowed, stored heat like a giant hidden battery. Combined with the ground's steady temperature, this thermal mass kept warm air flowing long after other homes had gone cold. But warmth wasn't the only factor that set Garrett's system apart. The brutal cold revealed structural weaknesses across the valley that the tunnel completely escaped. Despite ground temperatures dropping low enough to split foundation stones in several cabins, the stone-arched ceiling of Garrett's underground channel showed no cracks and no frost heave. The drainage system he had carved so carefully kept water moving beneath the structure, preventing ice blockages that could have shattered the collector box or sealed off airflow. When storms passed and circulation resumed, the lime-washed interior dried instantly. Even the gravel bed beneath the walls stayed functional while surface runoff froze solid above it. The contrast with conventional systems was stark. Many neighbors faced expensive spring repairs. 2 homes lost entire sections of clay-lime walling when the repeated freezing and thawing cycles pushed the material beyond what it could flex with. Rigsby discovered that one of his chimney stones had fractured clean through, crushed by ice expansion his masonry couldn't withstand. Several families found their interior walls damaged where moisture had condensed, frozen, and expanded behind paneling, a clear sign that their heating systems had failed to keep indoor conditions stable. By the time the roads became passable after the 14th, the Weather Bureau had already documented the severity of the Arctic outbreak. Combined with the valley's lived experience, the data left little room for doubt. Garrett's experimental system hadn't just performed well, it had outperformed every other method by a margin no one could ignore. The change in community attitude arrived quickly. The first visitor was Tom Rigsby. Once so confident in his opinions, and openly dismissive of Garrett's ideas, he now arrived with hat in hand, standing quietly beside the tunnel's intake, staring at the mica-covered collector that he had once mocked. Foolish, he had called it. Now he examined it with the humble focus of a man who had nearly frozen through a winter night. Next came Hiram Pike. His old arguments about heat rising and cold sinking vanished. Instead, he asked about slope calculations, stone thickness, and the exact angle of the collector box, questions born from a mind wrestling with new realities. Even Doc Abernathy appeared at Garrett's door. For the Valley's doctor, the tunnel's success wasn't just curiosity, it was professional interest. He had seen too many sick patients cramped near smoky stoves, breathing heavy air in poorly heated cabins. The clean circulation inside Garrett's home intrigued him. He wondered if his medical office could benefit from a similar system, something that provided warmth without smoke or harsh drafts. Most surprising of all was Reverend Josiah Martin. His early warnings about stagnant vapors had swayed much of the valley against Garrett's project. But the minister had spent the outbreak visiting sick families and had witnessed firsthand how poorly traditional systems performed. Now he asked Garrett if such a tunnel could be adapted for a schoolhouse, a Christian version, as he phrased it, revealing a man trying to reconcile old beliefs with the undeniable evidence of his community's suffering. Standing at the tunnel's entrance, Garrett explained the principles that guided the system's success. He tapped the dry stone arch with his knuckles to emphasize its strength, then broke down each element. A south-facing intake, positioned to catch the low winter sun. A protective collector hood, simple but effective, that kept rain out while amplifying solar heat. A steady downward drainage, ensuring water never pooled or froze inside. A gradual rise back to the foundation, allowing natural convection to move air without manual help. A stone or concrete lining which stored heat and maintained smooth airflow. A gravel base, managing condensation and ground seepage. A screened intake, preventing animals or debris from entering. An interior damper and small ceiling vent, completing a controlled and continuous air loop. Within 3 years, versions of Garrett's design appeared across the South River region and deeper into the Deerfield Valley. These weren't clones, each builder adapted the idea to his own land and skill level. Some dug longer tunnels where the land sloped favorably. Others added 2 separate intakes to serve larger rooms. Almost all included the mica-fronted collector hood, once a joke, now recognized as essential for capturing winter sunlight. A stonemason near Craigsville expanded the idea further, constructing a 60-foot, dual-channel system for a church hall that needed more heating power than a family-sized home. His professional work demonstrated that Garrett's principles scaled beautifully, inspiring craftsmen to consider earth-air systems for barns, lodges, and other public spaces. Other families experimented with hybrid designs, tying tunnels into existing root cellars so that one underground structure provided both food storage, cooling, and gentle heating for the cabin above. Soon the region began forming informal rules, a kind of frontier building code, based on these shared discoveries. Root cellars had long shown the valley that buried spaces stayed stable in temperature. Garrett's tunnel simply put that stability to work in a new way. Looking back from a modern perspective, Garrett's 1883 idea proved astonishingly ahead of its time. What he built by instinct and frontier engineering anticipated concepts that would receive formal names a century later. Ground-to-air heat transfer, thermal labyrinths, passive annual heat storage, and more. The Earth acting as a huge thermal battery. The importance of solar orientation. The efficiency of long-buried air channels. The natural convection created by height differences. All these would later become pillars of sustainable building design. And as engineers and architects eventually measured these principles scientifically, they confirmed what one man in rural Virginia had discovered with nothing more than stone, sunlight, and determination. That nature, if you build with it rather than against it, can heat a home better than any stove.